There's so many ways that racism and inequity and privilege show up in our system, and we've gotten really good at disguising those ways so that it doesn't sound offensive.
We're basically having a performance, a race dance. And I think Seattle's a place that has a race dance, where they don't actually talk about the issues in the most critical ways that matter.
If we really want our kids successful, they're going to need the skills that we teach them here about race and equity.
What happens when race really comes up in our classrooms? Mostly we have white students getting really uncomfortable.
We have a super segregated city, and it's created a bubble in the north end of whiteness and privilege.
And it's not that the system's broke. It was designed to work that way against you.
It's been more than 50 years since Seattle first tried and failed to integrate our schools. At Roosevelt High School in Seattle's predominantly white North End, the more things have changed, the more they have stayed the same.
We're getting ready to celebrate our 50th high school reunion. And a lot of the issues that we've been talking about are same issues that we were talking about 50 years ago.
We went to high school during a time of tremendous racial upheaval. We thought there was progress made. And we were suddenly basically hit over the head with this idea that this is the situation.
How long can you be peaceful when your people are dying?
And how could that not divide the country?
In some ways, there have been tremendous strides. On the other hand, I still remember debating the Kerner Commission report that we're moving towards two nations, separate and unequal. In that sense, I feel that we've slid backwards.
It just causes this, I don't know, like a thorn in my heart.
I have not seen anything that is more powerful at curing social problems. You know, poverty, healthcare, so on and so on and so forth. Education, independent of its ability to create wealth and income, serves people positively. Given finite resources, which is true, what's the best way to help Black people in the city? I can tell you one thing, it's the schools.
So I remember Joe as a little guard, very quick, with a shot that he had a lot of confidence in, but it didn't always go in. But he had the confidence.
I knew Tony more from the outside because he was a star. It was obvious that a lot of those players on the team knew each other and had played with each other before, and I was kind of like an outsider. We played basketball together, we practiced together, then we went home. We went to our different directions.
Joe and Tony sharing a court today is not extraordinary, but it is only because of a decision in a different court that they even went to the same school. In 1954, the Supreme Court decided that racially segregated schools were unconstitutional.
We had been taught in school that we were a nation under law, and the law said segregation was wrong.
In parts of the country, especially the South, this led to white outrage and violence.
Hatred is easier to organize than understanding, and there was a minority in our state who found it to their advantage to bring hate to Little Rock in 1957.
It was ugly, in-your-face racism, and schools were dragged into integration, kicking and screaming.
I don't know why they let people like him go to our school anyway, and I'm not the only one. My folks don't...
In the North, people did not want to confront the problem.
The feeling in Seattle was that that was an issue that the South needed to deal with and not here in Seattle.
Lawsuits were filed across the country enforcing integration through busing.
Seattle didn't really want to confront busing, but it knew it was there as a real threat.
In order to avoid an NAACP lawsuit, Seattle tried a half measure, the Voluntary Racial Transfer Program. In 1968, Leah began riding a bus from the Central District to Roosevelt.
First, I want to talk about why I went to Roosevelt. It was not my idea. I came home one day in 9th grade, and my parents said, "You're going to Roosevelt." I was like, "What?" No one consulted me.
I signed up for the voluntary transfer program because my friends were going there.
My parents felt Garfield, the central area, which was really the war zone, was not safe because back in those days, I had to walk to school and I had to walk through those neighborhoods.
We knew we were the pioneers. I would say we were on the defensive end when we got off that bus that first day.
My first day was a jumble. I mean, it's 10th grade. You're the new kids. I can remember in my English class, there was a guy from Windermere who wouldn't sit next to me and scooted his desk as far away as possible.
One day, a couple of us were walking down on the hallway, and we noticed these sayings on the water fountains, coloreds and for whites only. It was straight out of Mississippi or something.
All the black kids were in the back of the bus, and all the white kids were in the front. I realized part of that just the accident of how we got on, but there was basically no mixing.
I really didn't know I was a minority until I was, bussed out to Roosevelt High School.
It was very clear when you walked into the lunchroom, there was a black table, maybe a couple black tables in a sea of white kids.
It was during lunch because we had to take a break, just like a coffee break to have coffee. You need to have that race break.
When I got to Roosevelt, there were larger numbers and larger numbers of black kids I got to know, particularly played sports with. And I still only had a vague sense that they came from the central area and that they had to ride a bus, usually there and back each day, and had to cope with a hugely predominant white culture.
I even started to wear loafers.
The voluntary racial transfer program didn't achieve its goals of integration. At its peak in 1970, the vast majority of students who participated were students of color. White kids were not getting on buses. So in 1978, the Seattle School Board implemented the Seattle Plan, mandatory busing throughout the district.
There was no violence. There were no mass demonstrations. The school desegregation plan started without a hitch.
So I was in the mandatory busing program of the late 70s into the early 80s. So I left the Central District where I was born and raised and had to go to school in the North End at Roosevelt. Basketball at Roosevelt really cut down the color line for me, for sure. And possibly every young black man, young black woman that played on those teams. When we got to that gymnasium, the color went out the window, where you came from went out the window. You were just on that court together with that ball and that basket, trying to put buckets in.
When I came to Roosevelt in '58, I think there was one black student in our school at the time. Bringing in somebody as a freshman and just saying, well, here you are. And we've got 2,000 white students here and there's 4 black students. I didn't realize the problems they face coming here every day. They're getting up at 5 or 6 a.m. to take a bus all the way here, and we got to go over backwards to try to help in any way we can.
In the 1980s and 90s, the student population at Roosevelt was the most integrated it would ever be.
10 years ago at Roosevelt High School, this would have been an unlikely scene. 10 years ago, 90% of Seattle's public schools were mostly white or mostly black. Now, all but 15% are integrated.
To talk about whether the busing program worked or not, you have to figure out what it means by worked. What were the goals? Did it achieve its goals? For me, if that hadn't happened, in those years, it would have been virtually an all-white school.
Voluntary busing program, again, from my perspective, was a success, largely because of Tony and I sitting here today and talking.
I was able to go to different homes of kids that didn't look like me, experience different things, take that home and have conversations with my grandparents and my parents and the kids around the neighborhood. If I hadn't gone to Roosevelt, or I hadn't gone to school in North End, period, I would have never known about celery and peanut butter. I would have never known that.
It was the Wizard of Oz experience that I know what the man in the booth looks like. I know how they live. I know what they eat at dinner. So in that sense, Roosevelt prepared me to be very comfortable at a place like Harvard or Princeton, or to be a lawyer.
While busing created opportunities for some students, much of the burden of busing fell on families of color.
I don't believe that busing was a failure or a success. I just believe it was. Some of us came out ahead, and I think that some of us didn't.
So it breaks up the neighborhood concept. It breaks up the family concept, and that's another reason why I was against it.
That community's gone, and it's never coming back. And that could have been one of those direct effects.
I actually have a lot of family members who were like on those same buses, and you know, it was still hard because you were still going to a space where, you know, even though like you were accepted, you weren't really accepted. Like if you don't feel welcomed, you're not going to want to learn, you're not going to be paying attention.
At the same time, white parents reacted by pulling their children out of public schools. Within the first 4 years of mandatory busing, white student enrollment dropped by 34%.
White parents can escape integrated schools. It's easy to do. And that would be a failure of busing.
I think in the North, busing became a coded word for integration. Like, there are schools in this region that opened up as a response to busing. You know, in the South, they're called segregation academies. We don't call them anything in the North, but they exist here. Now, they might not be segregating now, but they were opened up to avoid integration of schools.
With disintegrating public support, dwindling resources due to white flight, and a lack of tangible results, the school board voted to end race-based busing in 1996. Other efforts to integrate the schools were met with more litigation. Another decade of lawsuits culminated in a Supreme Court ruling, which was the final nail in the coffin for Seattle's attempts at integration. So where does that leave our schools today?
As we think of the history of busing and integration in our schools, that has led us to the educational landscape of where we are today, from my experience, our schools are less integrated now than they have been in decades. We have the 5th worst opportunity gap in the entire country, yet we are one of the fastest growing economies. There's no mistake that in all of this growth, that many communities, especially the ones that look like me, have been left behind.
Of all the barriers to equity, the most fundamental may also be the most profound. Our schools look like our neighborhoods, and the way our neighborhoods look is no accident. Etched deep in the map of Seattle is a history of redlining and racist property covenants. These restrictions extended to African American, Asian, Native, and Jewish people. Until 1968, it was legal to discriminate against people of color in Seattle when renting apartments or selling real estate. We didn't adopt an open housing ordinance until after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated.
We were the last city to adopt an open housing ordinance. That's kind of sad for a city that prides itself on being progressive. We were the last ones.
Leah grew up in the central area as far north as redlining permitted the vast majority of Black people to live. Now she owns a house 3 blocks away from where her white grandparents used to live in Ballard.
So the greenhouse is where my grandparents and my great aunt and uncle lived. We were not allowed to come up to the house. They didn't want the neighbors to know that their great nieces were Black. I think the results of redlining are baked into Seattle. I think because we used busing as the Band-Aid to not face redlining, we never really dealt with it.
When we stopped busing kids out of their neighborhoods, school populations reverted to divisions rooted in racism and economic disparity. What is really troubling is how much inequity within our public system this creates.
It's not some magic that happens by putting a black student and a white student in the same classroom. The real issue is how do resources flow throughout our district? And historically, what our data has shown us is that resources in a disproportionate way follow white students as opposed to other student groups.
The difference between North End and South End schools, and as it correlates with race, is that those kids in the South End feel that they are disenfranchised, that they are the bottom of the school district's plan.
Students shouldn't have to worry about like where they live to get like a better education. It should be the same for all students. You walk into Roosevelt and you're automatically expected to go to a 4-year and graduate. But you walk into Cleveland, especially if you're a black student, and you're just expected to survive.
It's almost like there's two different school districts.
If we were to look at all the high schools in Seattle, you could look at the average amount of experience for teachers. I can tell you something, Southside teachers have less experience. Another thing you could do is look at PTA and foundation funds.
I've been to some fundraisers and galas and things like that that have been sponsored by PTAs, and you think that it was something out of The Great Gatsby, where I'm oftentimes at events on the South End where families are bringing food that they've made at home from potlucks and things like that. This is all happening within the same city, within the same 5-mile square radius.
And what's going to happen? You're just going to create some sort of disadvantage at some level.
So many programs are now parent funded that a wealthy school like Roosevelt has a really great band and other schools don't.
There is a tremendous amount of inequity between PTSAs in terms of how much money they bring to their schools. Absolutely. Is there a way to solve that? Maybe. We could pool all our funds and we could distribute them equitably. There is, however, this internal drive in people that they want to support the school that their children attend. And so as long as we segregate our neighborhoods into wealthy and less wealthy, that's going to be the end result.
Roosevelt has long had a reputation of privilege and influence and legacy. And I think a lot of those things, those are words that we use to be complimentary of an institution, but I think that a lot of those words are grounded in institutionally racist ideas.
Today in Seattle, inequity doesn't sound like this.
I don't know why they let
people like him. It sounds more like this.
Okay, I hear you. Oh, totally, we definitely can help you, like here are the steps, and then you walk out and you like never hear from them again.
Seattle nice is real.
I think Seattle has a very, very subtle racism that is out every day. And you have to be aware of it and see it when you travel through the streets.
A lot of people say like, oh, Seattle's one of the most progressive cities, we're so progressive, but you have students on top of students in front of school boards just fighting just to get their school renovated.
Going to school in Oklahoma, when I saw racism, it was right in my face. So I saw people that didn't like me for my color of my skin, and they would let me know. In Seattle, it's walking by a car and the door gets locked, or it's walking in the grocery store and purse is clutched.
White people in Seattle, and particularly in the North End, where you have a lot of economic privilege, alongside racial privilege, it's all good and inclusive until the moment that it impacts them.
You're saying one thing to the public at large, but don't mess with my schools, don't bring those kids here, don't do this, don't do this.
White parents have absolutely had an outsized voice in terms of advocacy in the school district. The consequences of listening to one subgroup at the detriment of other groups is clear in our opportunity gap. It's clear in our graduation rates. It's clear in the way that we offer and provide services throughout our district and how our systems are set up at every level of government.
Big picture inequities show up as everyday realities in hallways, in classrooms, in cafeterias.
The black people sit all on one table, and then the Asians will sit at one table, and all the white kids would be sitting like at one table. I feel like it's like the same story, like nothing changed.
I was hanging out with my friends and white friends, and there was a group of black students, and they noticed me and they said that I wasn't a real black person. So that kind of was just like a shock to me. I never heard anyone say that to me, and I am insecure, about my race being mixed is just very strange because you don't know where to fit in.
I was taking ESL the first year, but I didn't get along with the teacher because she was saying some stuff about how the black people don't live in North Seattle because they can afford living here. That's one of the reasons that I'm doing Running Start, because of I don't feel safe at that school and I don't have anybody to talk to about stuff that I'm going through.
Being a black student or a student of color, there's already structural barriers that get in your way. So on top of all that, just walking into a classroom and just wanting to learn and having somebody, especially somebody that you're supposed to trust to teach you, look at you with a presumption of guilt or look at you, oh, you're not gonna make it through this class, you're not gonna learn. When that constantly happens, you have that sense of self-doubt over and over again, and then it just deteriorates your education.
When you walk in the door, are these white students, are they gonna be racist to me? And what am I gonna do about it?
Issues of race at Roosevelt and other Seattle schools reach far beyond black students to all students of color. The Roosevelt High School community has launched multiple efforts to address these issues. In every conversation, student voice is critical.
This is a space where the younger generation is going to teach the older generation things that they didn't learn in school.
I came into Roosevelt with the mindset that things needed to change.
Leah Scott wanted to be part of that change, so she pursued student government at Roosevelt. As a sophomore, she was elected class representative.
I had noticed that the discussions we were having were mostly about decorations, mostly about hanging signs, putting those little handprints you see on the pillars, a lot of these just posters and stuff, and talking about, oh, what decorations are we gonna put up for Black History Month? Decorations are great, but what are they doing to help the communities within Roosevelt? There's performative and there's actual reformative. And I like to kind of break it down that way because I think it's a good way to do it.
What comes to mind immediately is social media, since students use it to reach out and communicate with one another, and a lot of kids might use social media for performative things to show their support for a cause, which can be good and helpful, but also if that's the only thing you're doing, I think it's not gonna help. You have to talk to people and learn things, and that is what helps with real reformative change.
Racial equity work forced me to stay alert and just not shy away from the fact that there's racism that exists.
There's some kids who are super mad about racism, and I think rightfully so, and there are some kids who deny that systemic racism exists, or they've never had to think about it before. And the racism comes from ignorance. There are so many students here who live in a bubble and only interact with students just like them.
So when race comes up in a discussion, I think that a lot of kids are uncomfortable discussing it.
People don't really take the time to kind of push through this awkwardness and really have that deeper conversation. And to do that, you need to recognize the importance of it and the importance your role has in it.
If you're white, you should have to feel uncomfortable talking about racism because you experience a level of privilege. It doesn't mean that you haven't had a hard life, but it means you haven't experienced this specific hardship, which is very impactful.
The issues being confronted in the halls of Roosevelt are playing out across the country. Today's environment is profoundly divided.
I think for me, what's at stake is the country.
The Confederate flag flew in the US Capitol. This feels very disconnected from what happens at Roosevelt, but it's a very similar issue. If we don't fix what's happening in our community at Roosevelt, in 20 years, when people are older and they are more powerful and they've been more entrenched in their views, terrible things can happen, like what happened on January 6th.
I think my grandchildren's stability, sanity is at risk.
Unless we figure out how to move forward as a collective society, then we are in grave danger of losing all of the values and all of the ideals that we as Americans hold dear. And it starts in every single classroom in this country.
If you look at the demographics of people, let's say 14 to 18, it's very diverse. If we're preparing students for the future society, they need to be able to talk about race. They need to be able to talk to people with different ethnicities than themselves, different genders than themselves, different orientations than themselves. And that needs to be explicit within the classroom.
If you come out of high school and you're white and you think that racism won't affect you, you're wrong. And I think it's a sad way to go through life not understanding other people, not having empathy for them.
As humans, we need different ideas. We can't just have a monolith of everyone thinking the same things. We need to have different backgrounds so that we are better people.
Seattle's really good at talking circles around social problems. Racism, homelessness, you name it. We can talk circles around it. Tackling racism needs to be more than performative.
The country has never lived up to its ideals, ever. It's moved toward its ideals. It's sometimes retreated from its ideals. But if you look at US history, you see that it's deeply embedded this resistance to reaching the ideals that the country was founded on.
When you're a dark man in a country where the Negro is demanding more and more an equal chance, you have the right to look back to discover if you are really moving forward or if the world is just moving beneath your feet.
When discussing racial equity, the kumbaya days are over.
Put all that politics stuff to the side. Like, this is our life.
Young people are the best way to do anything. Why? Because if you do it right, you're done.
I think it's on our shoulders. It's our responsibility to fight for racial equity.
I think we'll constantly be doing the work of racial equity, and I think we'll constantly be trying to strive for that perfect thing. We may not ever attain it, but I think it's important to always work towards it.
Your duty is to inspire those coming after you to join in the struggle to define and redefine what is American.
You don't want to be like Tony I, 68 years old, 50 years later, talking about the same things that we talked about 50 years ago.
I have granddaughters, and I tell her every day you walk out this door, go be brilliant and go do something right for somebody else, and it's gonna come back to you. And I believe she's going to do that. I keep telling her, you guys are gonna get it right one day. I probably won't see it, but I know I put this in you now to go get it right.
If we don't really get involved, I think we're right back at the Kerner Commission again. 2 nations, separate and unequal, 1 black, 1 white. Who wants to live there?